Hey everyone, it's Ben from Board to Bits, and this is part 2 of our Unity 101 series, and today we're going to be talking about how to make classes communicate with one another. Last time we talked about how game objects and classes relate to one another. Now we really want to see, when you have a couple of different classes, maybe you have, in this case, a player and an enemy, how do we get them to recognize that each other is there so that we can have them actually interact, which is usually the crux of a game, is getting these different things to interact dynamically and giving the player agency to impact the outcome. So right here we have a very simple game example. We've got these two objects here, player in blue and enemy in red. And the enemy just has a simple enemy script and it's got a health stat. The player has two scripts on it, a player input script, which is going to track our keyboard presses, and a player script. Let's dive into MonoDevelop to see what those actually do. So player input script, all it does right now is every frame it checks to see if we've pressed the A button down. What we want it to do then is to tell the player to attack, and what that means is that the player has this public attack function. And what that attack function really does is ultimately tells the enemy to take damage. And finally, the enemy has a take damage function as well here, public function, that what it does is it takes 2 health away from it. It takes its current health score and so it lowers it by 2. Simple enough, but when we first start doing this, we can kind of look and see and go, well, how do I get this script to tell this script what to do? I could try doing something like player.attack, but we see that there's no completion. That isn't a thing. If I save that and go back to Unity, we see that it says here an object reference is required to access the non-static member player attack, which in a very short form is saying unless you have a static function, you can't just call the overall class. You need to actually call an instance of that class. So right now, doing this, what I'm trying to do is just call this class, whereas what I really need to be doing is calling this player script from my player input script. I need this script to get access to this script. And what calling a script basically is doing, or calling an instance of a class is doing, is calling a reference. And what we can do is say a reference is basically just a variable that we can put a class into. So in this case, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say player, and we're just going to call this player character. So this now can be a reference to some instance with the player class attached to it. How do we do that? There's a few ways. I'm going to delete this because otherwise it's going to keep on giving us errors. Tell player to attack. So first way we can do this is we can say make this a public reference or public variable, and now when we go back over to Unity, we see that this is now available to us in our inspector. And so what we can do is we can actually take this script here and drop it into the field. And that now has a reference to our player character. Now obviously this is within the same game object, and interestingly enough, you can actually take any of these and drop it in there as long as it has a player script attached to it. I can take box collider. Actually, I can't, sorry. But I can take the entire game object and drop it in there. It's the exact same thing that's there here if I delete it and show you. Because this has a player script attached, I can go player, drop it in there. Works fine. So that's the first way. Manually you can drag and drop objects with the class attached into a field like that. However, this can get very cumbersome very quickly if you have many different objects in a game. Say you're dynamically populating your world. You've got enemies appearing every few seconds. You can't physically be there dropping that in every time. So we obviously need better solutions than that. But one way you can do it, especially in a simple situation or if it's a starting thing that only this one thing's ever going to need to be there, you can just manually attach classes to one another. So now what we can do, though, because this is attached, what we can say here is player character dot attack. And so now this, because this has a reference to a player class, we can call this public attack function from this reference. And so that's, like I say, one way to get these two classes talking to one another. Now there's actually a little bit of a better way, though, that we can do this, particularly because these are both in the same GameObject. And that is a function called GetComponent. If you're not familiar with it, how GetComponent works is basically it looks through the current GameObject that you're in and looks through every class and goes, is this the class I want? No. Is this the class I want? No. Is this the class I want? No. This is the class I want? No. If it finds it, it returns it. If it doesn't find it, it just returns null and says there's no class of that attached to this GameObject. But what's very convenient about this is what we can say is at the very start of our game, I'm going to call void awake. And what that does is at the very beginning of the scene, it is going to call this awake function on this object. And we're going to say player character equals GetComponent, and then you have to give it the type you want. So in this case, we want player. And be sure you do your parentheses at the end so that you're actually calling the function. But so this is saying I want the player character to equal GetComponent player. So now, when we go back here, even if I delete this, delete that, so we have no player character attached right now, I can hit play, and it automatically fills that in for us because we told it right here to say get that component within this GameObject and make it the player character reference. And now we can also see here, because that is attached. Actually, you know what? It's not going to. We can try hitting attack right now. We hit A, nothing really happens. And that's because we don't actually have anything in this attack script. What I could do is say debug.log attacking. So now if I hit play here, the input is aware of this script. So now when I hit A here, we see that attacking appears down here. It knows that I'm attacking. If we go like this, I can go multiple times. It keeps on happening. I am attacking. So these two are talking to each other now. And that's great, but that's within this one GameObject. So that's fine. But now how do I get this communication to continue? The next step, how do I get the player script to know about this enemy script way over on this other object? And there's a few ways we can do this as well. The first way, probably the arguably the most optimal way, is to go through the scene's hierarchy. And what I mean by this is that when you're creating your scene hierarchy here, it's a hierarchy because everything is either a parent or a child of something. In this case, these are both children of units. So what we could do is we could say something like this. In the same way that we have this player reference here, we're going to create an enemy reference here. Public enemy character. So now, in the same way again, we're going to say void awake. It's a good idea whenever you're getting a reference to something, if you can, and you know you're going to be using it a lot, store it. Store it in a variable like this one. You don't have to do that. You could just as easily go down here and get the enemy when the function is actually called. And in some cases you might need to do that. If you're doing something, say, where you're checking for a collision, and when that collision happens you need to just hit that thing that you're colliding with, you need to do that on the spot. But in a case like this where there's only the one enemy for us, we can, when we open the scene, we can say this is the enemy, here's a reference to it, and now we can keep that so we don't have to keep on searching for it every time we need it. So here, we can't just say GetComponent enemy. We can't do that, and we actually need to make this enemy character equals GetComponent enemy. If we do this right now, the problem is we're just going to get null because there is no enemy character, or there's no enemy class, I should say, on this game object. In fact, we should be able to see that happen. If I go like this, enemy character, non-enemy, we hit play. Nothing there because there's no enemy attached here. Instead, though, what we can do is make use of this transform component. The transform component is very powerful because what it does for us is it's kind of the link between this game object and the hierarchy. It's sort of the exit door into the hierarchy space. What we can say is enemy character equals transform dot parent, and what that does, transform dot parent will get you gets you the transform of the parent object. So player dot transform dot parent goes one level up to this units. So that's not exactly where we want to be. We actually want to get this enemy script. Well, the enemy script is in this child, so we need to somehow get the component from the child. And we can do that via a very convenient thing called GetComponent in children. Children. The component we're looking for is enemy. So now what this is doing, going from the transform to that parent, that units object that we have that's holding these characters, and then it's going to find an enemy somewhere in its children. So now if we hit play here, we see that enemy character is now referenced to the enemy. So now we've done it. We've gotten out of the player script and to the enemy. So now what we can do is actually give our script something to do here. Instead of just saying attacking, what we can do is we can actually get this enemy character dot take damage and tell it to do that whenever we attack. So now what we finally see here is the goal of what we're trying to do here, and we can say go to our enemy. We see he's at full health, but now we hit A and attack. Goes down to 8, 6, 4, 2, 0. It actually keeps going because we don't tell it to get destroyed or anything. But we can see that that is working. Right here we see that number is going down every time we hit attack. Now, but let's say we've set up our scene a little bit differently here. Let's say we don't have this units parent object. Now we don't have that direct connection from the player to the enemy. We can no longer use GetComponent. You can no longer do transform.parent. There isn't even a parent. We can't get this far. This won't work for us. So how do we find this enemy character now? Well, there are a couple of other options we have. One is a function called find. And we can say find object of type. Actually, is it GameObject_find? Sorry, first one we have is GameObject.find. This one, and there's a reason I'm going through them in this order. But GameObject.find, what we can do is we can say, give it the string, which is the name of the object. In this case, our object is enemy. So now, we go here, because the name is enemy. But we notice there's an issue. Cannot implicitly convert type of Unity engine.GameObject to enemy. And that's because when we do GameObject.find, we're actually finding the container game object and not the class that we want to find. However, we already know now that once we're inside of the game object, we can get any other component we need to. Once we're in this game object right here, we can get to this script here by just saying .getComponent enemy. And now that will then, from here going to the game object level, get us right to the class we want. So again, now we hit play, and we see that enemy once again is populated there. So that's one way you can do this. However, you might have multiple enemies, or you might have, if you're cloning enemies, you're instantiating multiple enemies in a scene, this might not be the best way for you to do this. Or you might have multiple things with the same name, or you don't know exactly what the name of something is. In which case, this isn't as convenient. However, there's another way that you can do this, is say you have this enemy, and you want to you can give it a tag. If you go to enemy, up to where it says tag untagged, and we can say add a tag. It then gives you this list of custom tags you can create. So I'm going to create one, and I'm going to call it bad guys. Now what you can do here, instead of doing find enemy by the name of the object itself, you can say GameObject.find with tag bad guys. The other reason this works nicely is say you have multiple enemies. You don't know which one is in the room, though. There might have a goblin, you might have an ogre, you might have a troll, you might have a dragon. They all have different names, but they're all tagged bad guys. Again, you can find that object, but again, be aware you have to say then GetComponent enemy. Get that final class, and once again, and make sure, one thing that's a little bit weird, when you go and add tag, it doesn't automatically add that new tag for you. So make sure then you go back into tag, check it off. Now it's a bad guy. We hit save, we hit play. And we see that our enemy is there again. So these are 4 options you have of finding things. There's going to be one more I'm going to show you. However, I'm only going to cover it briefly because it kind of gets into another region of Unity scripting, which is statics, which are their own kind of beast, and I'm definitely going to do a separate video on statics. But I will quickly show you one more way that you could do all this, and I'm going to do this with the player object, because the enemy, chances are you're going to have multiple enemies in your game, but chances are you only have one player. So what you can do is say something like public static player instance, and this creates a reference, a static reference to your player. Why this is useful is because this static reference, you can, remember when we first started this and I said, oh, you can't just say player.attack because there's no static reference to it. Well, we still can't do that, but what we can now say is player.instance.attack, because what this does is Unity is assuming right now that if there's an instance, if something exists in this reference, it is a player class instance, because that's what we told it here. It's a player. Instance is a player, so therefore instance has an attack function. Now we do have to make sure we actually put something into this. So on awake, we're going to say instance equals this. And this might look familiar to you if you've done anything with the singleton pattern, but this is kind of the basic building block of that, which is that this player, there is only this one instance of this player, and so when the player in this scene starts the scene, it's going to say, hey, I am the instance. Anything that's looking for the instance of player, come talk to me. So when player input says, hey, instance of player, attack, it happens right there. So we can actually comment out all of this. Control-Alt-C will comment your text in MonoDevelop, which is nice. And now all we have to do is say player instance, because we're at the beginning of the scene saying player instance right here. So once again now we hit play. We no longer have that player in our player input. However, we can still hit A, and we see this number go down, because the player itself now knows, hey, it's calling for me, I can attack the enemy. So these are 5 ways that you can connect your classes together and get them to communicate with one another. Like I say, I would definitely recommend things like the GetComponent method or connecting through the hierarchy. You can get a little bit even deeper into this with things like when you start instantiating objects. I'll probably do another video about this, getting into those deeper levels of communication and kind of cataloging the different objects you have in your scene. But like I say, I hope this gets you started in being able to get these disparate game objects and disparate classes to be able to communicate with one another and get your game moving. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.